So we're going to kind of zoom out a bit for this second class. There's 5 classes in total, so there's a lot to kind of cover in order to give a very broad overview of, you know, everything, which is kind of the idea. Um, we did say that the Four Noble Truths was, broadly speaking, um, the blueprint for everything that the Buddha taught, but really we're going to kind of focus on a little bit broader themes for the second class before we go back into looking at the Four Noble Truths. So we'll start by talking about the mind in general. So the Tibetan Buddhist understanding of consciousness or the mind, and really from the Buddhist perspective, those are two words that are used interchangeably. They don't mean different things. They're talking about the subjective experience that a sentient being has. You could say that it's comprised of perceptions and conceptions. So, perceptions would be experiences of things that are uh, being interacted with by the sentient being, and a conception would be some sort of judgment or appraisal of that which is being interacted with. So you might look at a painting, and so the visual perception of the painting, is what is occurring to the eye consciousness. And then you might think, well, that's a beautiful painting, or that moves me in a particular way. Or you might think, well, I could do that. It's simplistic, it's uninteresting. Those are conceptions, those are judgments or appraisals about whatever it is that the sentient being is engaging with or interacting with. And sentient being is a phrase that's often used in Buddhism. It literally it is an English translation of Samchen, or mind possessor. So we, as humans, are Samchens, mind possessors, sentient beings. Um, Plants are not, from the Buddhist perspective. Plants, you know, grow, they change. His Holiness gives the test of volitional movement to determine whether or not a living thing is a sentient thing. So, plants, as I said, are alive. They grow, they change, they take in nutrients, they, engage in maybe respiration, whatnot. Um, but they're not mind possessors, and we can, as I said, His Holiness gives us the test of looking for volitional movement to determine between a living thing and a sentient thing. So plants have movement, but they grow only, or they move only in dependence upon changes in their environment. Um, if there's no sunlight, if there's no, nutrients, if there's not sufficient, if the external conditions are not correct, then there won't be any movement. Of course, humans still need to be able to access food and water and so on. But given that, if you were to video, a human being for a day, and you would observe that that human being moves, just like you can observe that a flower, might move or unfold or, in some way change from over the course of 24 hours. You couldn't describe every single movement that that human makes as being completely dependent upon a change in the environment. And that isn't true for a plant. A plant will only be able to move in response to sunlight. And then you've got, other organisms, that are very, very, very simple, like single-celled organisms, protozoa, things like that. They also move. Maybe they have flagella or something, and they can move. But When you describe their movement, it isn't, they never just decide to go from point A to point B because they get bored or they're not sure if it's always because there's a change in the chemical gradient of the water, or maybe they're moved by, the current, or they're moved by wind, or they don't just feel like, looking at another place to maybe there is or maybe there isn't food. But other very, very simple organisms like flies, like mosquitoes, like ants, certainly those are all sentient beings from the Buddhist perspective, because they also have movement, but it's more complicated, and they do sometimes just check out a place. They're just looking for something, or they just they have movement that can't be described as a preceding change that occurred in their environment. They choose to move somewhere. Um, so even very, very simple things are sentient beings from the Buddhist perspective, but there comes a point where um, it the living thing can't host consciousness. And if the living thing cannot be a host to consciousness, then it's not a sentient thing from the Buddhist perspective. So, as a sentient being, we are a mind possessor, as are, as I said, animals and dogs and cats and mosquitoes and flies and horses and whatnot. So all mind possessors have a consciousness that is associated with that particular physical form. And the definition of that mind or that consciousness that that physical form is connected to is that which is can be described as clear and knowing, or clarity and awareness. Yeah, did you have a question? No, you're just waving to somebody, or no problem. So, all sentient beings possess a mind, and that mind, the definition of that mind, whether it's a human mind or an animal body's mind, is that which is clear and knowing, or that which possesses clarity and awareness. And clarity and awareness have some slightly different aspects to them. One aspect of clarity is the capacity of the mind to sort of illuminate that which it is in relationship with, or that which it is observing. The eye, and so it is able to engage with that object. It's able to distinguish or um, generate an understanding of that object. And that's also, so that's, and also clarity or clear also refers to the nature of the mind as being formless, being energetic, not having a particular size or shape or color. Or any sort of physical characteristic. It refers to its energetic, non-physical nature. So the mind is a non-physical, energetic entity or phenomena that is, when it is directed toward that which can be known, when it's directed towards some sort of existent, it is able to generate some sort of internal representation or some awareness of that which it's being directed toward. And there are six types of consciousness or minds, six main different ways, six main minds, six different types of consciousness. So we have here the five, normal bodily sense consciousnesses. These are all ways in which, and of course, this is for a human being. Not all sentient beings possess all five. There are animals that are blind, for example, or animals that understand the world through different senses. But for a human, and even humans, not all humans have all six of these, but generally speaking, humans possess these six consciousnesses. So we have the five bodily sense consciousnesses. We can become aware of things in our environment through the five bodily sense consciousnesses. And then we have the mental sense consciousness or mental sense power. So as I mentioned, this gets at the distinction between a perception and a conception. So when we taste, when we touch, when we see, when we hear, when we smell, then there's data that is coming into the mind um, on the basis of that particular sense power. And then the mental sense power is coming along kind of in the next moment and making judgments, making determinations, making appraisals of various kinds about that sensory data. So when we eat something, we, decide whether or not we want to repeat that experience, whether or not that was pleasant, whether it was unpleasant. If we have an allergic reaction, then then the mental sense consciousness tells us to stay away, labels it as dangerous. Um, when we touch something, if it's rough or it's smooth or it's, maybe scratchy, um, then again, the mental that in and of itself, smooth, rough, scratchy, that's just data, that's just sensory data. But the mental sense power would develop a preference for things that are smooth, things that are soft, things that are pleasant, and it would develop an aversion to things that maybe could cut the skin, that feel, like sandpaper. Nobody buys sandpaper and like puts it around and like touches it from time to time because that's just not a thing that people do because it's unpleasant. It's like generally unpleasant to touch that kind of surface. Um, but that's just data that the mental sense power is making a judgment about. And the reason why it's important to be clear and to be precise about how the mind works in this way is because for us, these perceptions and conceptions, although they're not arising simultaneously, there's the perception, and then very, very quickly there's a conception. For us, distinguishing between the two, for an ordinary sentient being, distinguishing between the two is very, very difficult. It's not a way of thinking that we're used to. We are used to seeing, tasting, touching, etc. And then the experience of pleasant or unpleasant just comes along with that perception in such a way that it gives rise to our experience of that object as being pleasant or unpleasant. We feel as though the pleasantness or the unpleasantness is present in the object itself, that it's a quality of the object itself. When it's something that the mental sense power is layering on top of that base sensory data. We can't say that smooth is, objectively, we can't say that smooth is pleasant and rough is unpleasant. We can just say that the mind, labels it as such because of, past experience, maybe culture, and, in some contexts, it changes, from time to time. Um, if you, um, if you're drowning, for example, and someone throws you a rope, that rope might be really coarse. It might be, really heavy twine. It might be kind of biting into your palms, when you're grabbing onto it. But you're going to be elated. You're going to be thrilled, right? Because of the context of that situation, even though, your hands might be even bleeding or, really, really painful, you recognize that you aren't going to drown. You previously were going to drown, and now you're not. So the mind is, and it's the same, but on a different, context. If someone were to say, hey, here's this really, really, itchy, scratchy, coarse piece of rope, like, do you want to just play around with it? You'd be like, well, no, of course, that's aversive, as an experience. I want to be separated from that. So that, in a way, demonstrates, and other examples would be, that one person might really gravitate toward sweet foods. And for other people, sweet foods are, kind of take it or leave it. They like, savory, they like cheeses and, that really savory kind of umami sorts of flavors is what they would go for, what they would prefer, given a choice. And they could kind of take or leave the chocolate cake, you know, and those people like think the other person is crazy. Like, how could you not want to have that dessert? How could you prefer, having and so, but it's the same object, right? But it's the mind that is perceiving or conceiving in that case, conceiving the object in very, very different ways, even though the object itself, the chocolate cake is not actually a different object. It's just being conceived of by different sentient beings in very, very different ways. Um, but both people, the person who gravitates toward the chocolate cake and the person who's kind of very neutral toward the chocolate cake, or even maybe is allergic to chocolate, right? So they see the chocolate cake and they see danger. They see, something that is a threat. So they back away. They're really averse to it. But the object itself is exactly the same to both minds, in terms of the actual constituents of the object. There's no difference, but the experience that the people are having is very, very different. So it's important to be able to think really clearly about how the mind actually works so that we can unpack exactly how the mind is affected by the environment, exactly how the mind, because as we'll talk, as the course goes on about how we want to, develop an understanding of what states of mind are agitating, disturbing to the mind, what states of mind give rise to actions that can cause harm to others. Um, and in many cases, that mental state is being impelled by a conception to a perception, right? So somebody, we're driving and somebody, cuts us off in traffic, and we perceive that that car is, maybe being operated in what seems like an unsafe manner. It's quite close to our car. We perceive that there was some, threat. But then we conceive that they did it on purpose, right? That they're just negligent, that they saw us and they didn't care, and they're rude. How dare they? And then we respond with anger. We respond by laying on the horn, rolling down our window, screaming, invectives toward them. So we really escalate that situation because of a conception that added information to a perception that really that doesn't have to be like we have control, right? We could decide that they didn't see us. We could decide, or, we could decide that um, maybe they have some sort of emergency and, they're in a panic and they're not able to navigate, in the same sort of way that when they're not in that situation, of course, they would drive more carefully, but they're panicked, they're rushing, they're afraid. Uh, and if we knew that for a fact, if it was a friend of ours that we were traveling behind and we knew that they had some sort of emergency and they cut us off, we wouldn't react angrily. So, we're making a judgment about a, you know, perception that leads to a mental state. And then that mental state, if it's an angry mental state, it can lead to harming that person and so on. So the more that we can understand the distinction between perception and conception, and the more that we can recognize how the mental sense power is influencing what is happening in the mind, um, the more control we have over what is happening in the mind, and the more tools that we would have to be able to guide what is arising and sort of um, train the mind in such a way that those states of mind that endanger others are, reduced over time, and the mental states that are beneficial toward others, loving kindness, compassion, generosity, patience, and so on, those minds are really enhanced by understanding how the mind works. Um, and of course, Buddhism is about training the mind. It's not about training the body, and it's singularly focused on really developing our understanding of our own mind. Any questions so far? So then we can say that this phenomenon of mind, of consciousness, that is an energetic phenomenon that um, is in relationship to objects of awareness, uh, is composed from the Buddhist, again, from the Tibetan Buddhist perspective. The mind is a continuity of mental events or mental moments, individual moments where consciousness is in relationship to an object of awareness. So the icon, and as it says here, one or more of the six consciousnesses, um, and then you have an object of awareness, and then what's here called a prior moment in the continuity of mind. So this is what forms the basis of any individual mental event is you have, your eyes are open, or you're tasting something, you're touching something, you're listening to something, one of the sense consciousnesses is active, and then it is aware of a particular object of awareness. So the eye consciousness would have to be aware of a visual form. The ear sense power or ear consciousness would have to be aware of an auditory sound. The taste consciousness would have to be aware of a taste, and so on. And it's possible that, as it says, one or more. So oftentimes you've got one of the five sense powers becoming aware of its respective object. And then the mental sense power is also going to be active as well. It could also be, though, that the mental sense power is active by itself when we daydream, or when we plan, or when we remember. Um, we're not tasting, I mean, there might be sensory data that is coming in because we're awake and we're in an environment, we're hearing birds, but what we're attending to, what we're really focused on is a memory or a plan. That's kind of what the mind is absorbed into. The other, kind of data that, of course, we're sitting somewhere, so we're getting, there's a feeling of being supported, or we're standing, so there's a feeling of the floor. There's all kinds of sensory data that's always coming in, but we're kind of rejecting that because we're thinking about, oh, I have to do this report for tomorrow, or I have to make this plan to meet my friend for dinner, and where are we going to go, and when am I going to leave, and how am I going to get there, and what's traffic going to be like. So that's really a mental event that it's not informed by any of the physical sense powers. The physical sense powers are not assisting in that particular mental event. It's purely a mental event. That's also possible. That also sometimes happens. So you just need one or more of any one of the six consciousnesses, and then an object of awareness. And then when it says a prior moment in the continuity of mind, uh, what you could say is when your eyes are closed, and then you open them, technically, it takes time for the light to hit your eyeballs, for that, it's imperceptible, but still you need to actually open your eyes and then have, like, a moment where the data is coming in, and then you're able to have sensory data. So If you go into a room where there's absolutely no sound, totally soundproof, your ear sense power is functioning. But then, you have to exit that in order to have this continuity. So this prior moment has to, exist, and then you have a sound, and then it can be perceived. So it's sort of a technical point that I'm not sure has any real practical implications, that particular point. But, there is a moment before the object of awareness can really be perceived where that sort of the tape has to be running in a way, like the video camera has to be on and sort of, recording in order for mental events to get noticed. Um, so another aspect of all consciousnesses, all minds, is that it is not only that which is clear and knowing, and not only, does it for us have those six different divisions, but it is also both beginningless and endless. So the mind that is associated with this particular physical form, I think we alluded to that, in the first class, that coming together occurred for us in the womb, but prior to that coming together, the physical form didn't exist prior to that coming together in the womb. You could say the potential, existed, in the mother and the father, and even going back to their mother and father and so on. There was a potential, for that, but this actual physical form didn't, you could also say, really didn't exist until that first moment. In a sense, they're kind of both true. There's this potential, and then the potential is realized or actualized, in the womb. But the mind existed just as it exists now, prior to that coming together in the womb. So, from the Buddhist perspective, that mind immediately before coming together in the womb, that mind was experiencing what in Tibetan Buddhism is called the bardo, or the in-between state. Um, but then prior to that, it was experiencing an incarnation. It was experiencing a form. It was having a lifetime. It was experiencing some type of lifetime. And then it experienced a separation from that lifetime, which we would call a death, when body and mind separate. And then immediately after the death, it begins to experience the intermediate state, or the bardo. And then the bardo comes to an end when the mind becomes associated with yet another physical form, in our case. Um, so you've got lifetimes, and then they're separated by bardos, and then you've got just more lifetimes, and it's beginningless and endless. And so what the mind is this continuity of these mental events, these moments of perception and conception. And they say that the yogis are able to perceive 64 discrete mental events in the space of what they call a finger snap. I don't know, so a finger snap is a very small unit of time. It's milliseconds. So in each millisecond, these high yogis are able, they've so trained their minds that they can perceive that in that millisecond there are 64 discrete individual perceptions or conceptions that are occurring. Um, and so in a way, it's sort of like they are able to slow down the kind of frames of their own consciousness, like a movie, right? When we watch a movie, we perceive it as continuous, as a flow, that is indiscernible. But it is frames. The actual media that the movie is based on is slices, frames. Um, and but we don't experience those frames. We experience this perfect kind of flowing continuity. So I feel like it's very similar to that, where you can get to a point where you can look at the frames, where you can look at, each slice of how the mind is becoming aware of what it is observing. And if you don't do that, then it just appears that it's seamless and it's just sort of this movement of time. Um, but really, these mental events, where one of the six consciousnesses is engaging with an object and giving rise to an experience, is what the mind is just doing. And it has always done that, and it will always do that. That's just what the mind does. So that's a little bit about the Buddhist understanding of all minds, our mind, every mind. Any questions before we move on to the next topic? Okay, so we're going to then switch again to a different topic and talk about what it means, um, kind of in two different ways, what it means to be a Buddhist. The first way is what philosophically um, do Buddhists accept as having to be true about what they understand about reality, about what they understand about the nature of things. And these are called the four seals. So here, seal in a way is referring to a similar idea to like a wax seal on an envelope that has the maybe like the royal signet ring pressed into it, which certifies that the contents of that letter actually validly belong to that monarch, right? When the monarch, because only the monarch possesses that signet ring. So, in ancient times, when you got a letter and it was sealed with wax and it had the emblem of the monarch, you knew that the contents of it really genuinely came from that monarch. You could validate the contents. So this is a way also of validating Buddhist philosophy. If what a person says is in alignment with the four seals, then we can say it's a validly Buddhist teaching. If it's contradictory to one or more of the four seals, then that's fine, but it just means it's some other philosophical system. It's a non-Buddhist philosophical system. That's not good or bad. It's just not the Buddhist philosophical system. So it's a way of also being able to judge for oneself. Am I receiving teachings? This other person is saying they're teaching me Buddhism, right? But maybe I don't really, I'm not sure. But i- is it true that what they're saying is in alignment with the four seals? If they're saying something that's not in alignment, then we would say, well, they're mistaken. They've misunderstood something, and they're not actually presenting authentic Buddhism, authentic Buddhist philosophy. So the first of the four seals is all compounded phenomena are impermanent. So we have to define both compounded phenomena and the word impermanent to figure out what this first seal is telling us, what we're meant to understand about this first seal. So a compounded phenomena is anything that exists as a product that which is composed of other things. So essentially anything on our planet, because that's where we are, and from a practical standpoint, if we can taste it, if we can touch it, if we can pick it up, if we can eat it or, manipulate it in any way, it's a compounded phenomena. It exists because, there's various elements in it, carbon and, whatever, iron, nickel, all kinds of different, compounds, all kinds of different molecules. Um, you know, um, yeah. And so anything that exists in our world really is a compounded phenomena. It has also, it has a top and a bottom and, a front and a back. And, so definitely everything is composed of other things. It exists as a product. And then we have to define impermanent. So impermanent, this is another one of those words that is a translation of a Tibetan word that where the English word doesn't always mean what the Tibetan word means. Because when we think of impermanent in just ordinary English vernacular, we often would describe something that is impermanent as something that doesn't last forever, something that will cease. And that is not always the case with an impermanent phenomenon from the Buddhist perspective. For example, the mind is an impermanent phenomenon from the Buddhist perspective. And the reason that the mind is an impermanent phenomenon is because, and the reason why anything from this definition is an impermanent phenomenon is because it is changing moment by moment by moment. It is not static. It is always in flux. It is always changing. And this is true of also all physical things in our and as we just said, the mind is beginningless and endless, right? The mind doesn't ever cease. The mind can't reach an end. The mind can't just go out of existence. It can't cease to be. So the mind is both impermanent but also eternal. There are also many things, though, where it is true that they are impermanent and temporary. Uh, so, and that would apply to just about, just about everything else. So tables and chairs and, cameras and, computers and whatnot, they are changing moment by moment by moment, so they are impermanent. And also they are tending toward their dissolution. They will cease to be what they are. At some point, they will go out of, it may take a very, very long time, but they will cease. That particular phenomenon will cease at a particular time in the future. So they're both impermanent and temporary. But the word impermanent itself is only getting at the aspect of the phenomenon wherein it is changing moment by moment by moment. It is no two moments in the continuity of the phenomenon are the same. That is what impermanent means. So the first seal, all compounded phenomena are impermanent, is just saying that if something exists as a product, is composed of other things, then it is changing moment by moment by moment, that no two moments in the continuity of that thing are identical, that, in a very, very subtle way, it's different. And this is also important because that kind of change is occurring below the level of our physical senses. We think if we have a coffee cup that we really like, or, you know, we don't, someone else has a coffee cup that we don't really like, and we get annoyed every time we see it. If there's something in our environment, every day that we wake up and we see it, we're like, oh, that's my coffee cup. That's the same coffee cup that was there yesterday. That's the same coffee cup that was there 2 days ago. And from the Buddhist perspective, that isn't true. Um, you know, not only is it not the same as it was yesterday, but it isn't the same as it was, 1/1000th of a second ago, 1/1 millionth of a second ago. In an imperceptible way, it is different. In an imperceptible way, there's an atom of that phenomenon that has, or an electron or something, that's no longer bound to it, that, so it has changed. It is not identical. It has changed in an imperceptible way. And we know that over time, the things that we use, they get chipped, they get dirty, they get scratched. Um, that kind of impermanence is at the level of the senses, right? That can take, and that depends. Um, that can take days, that can take months or years, decades, in various, if it's, solid steel or something, it may not visibly change for a very long time. Um, but the fact that that there are changes that at some point become perceptible to our senses is the result of these imperceptible changes that are occurring over time. Uh, just like, for example, with our physical body, right? Our physical body is a compounded phenomenon. We are changing, we're aging moment by moment by moment. Um, but it takes time. We think we're aging because we see the gray hair or we see the new wrinkle or whatnot. But, really in each millisecond, we are aging. There are cells that are being born, cells that are dying. Our telomeres are shortening. The body is reacting to environmental toxins and physical you know, different stresses and so it's working less and less well generally over time, and that's the aging process. But it isn't that it is the gray hair or it is the wrinkle. It's a continuous process of change that really began in the womb. It began at the first moment of conception. Then you had, two cells became four and eight and 16 and so on. And then organs developed and tissues developed. And it's a one continuous process of change that is occurring moment by moment by moment. And under normal circumstances, if we die of old age or we die of illness, whatever, then that is, and even if we die in a fire or we die, that's also an implication of impermanence, right? If the body wasn't impermanent, meaning it was permanent, meaning it wasn't changing moment by moment by moment, then it couldn't be impacted by fire. You could put fire on a body, and because the nature of that body is permanent rather than impermanent, it wouldn't be able to interact with that external event. Or the bullet, would bounce off instead of penetrating and instead of affecting, because it's a permanent phenomenon. So the fact that the body is impermanent and the fact that things are impermanent is what permits outside forces to act on them, to cause change. You can take a knife and you can damage something. You can cut something. You can change. You can physically manipulate it, and that's an outside force. But it's only allowable because of the impermanent nature of the phenomenon, the fact that it is changing moment by moment by moment. Um, So then the second seal, all contaminated things are unsatisfactory. So here again, we have to define a contaminated thing and we have to define unsatisfactory. So contaminated thing, I never actually figured out what the Tibetan word or phrase for contaminated thing is, and I never really asked anyone if they had um, other ways of in English of thinking about what is meant, because I've always found it to be kind of a harsh phrase. Contaminate. It sounds quite intense. It sounds almost moralistic in a way. But the definition here, is on the screen, that which has past karma and delusion as its origin. Um, so really, it just means an ordinary thing. Um, so when you hear contaminated thing, really you can just think of ordinary thing, because um, we are ordinary. And ordinary just means not enlightened, not, not the mind of a Buddha, not the body of a Buddha, not the environment of a Buddha. Those are not ordinary things. Those are enlightened things. So they don't have past karma and delusion as their origin. They are enlightened, and so that they are of a different continua. They are of enlightened continua. Um, our body, our mind, our environment um, are all things that have past karma and delusion as their origin, uh, because we are ordinary. We are not yet enlightened. So there is sort of a, a force that is presently operating, that is impelling, that is creating this kind of moment, has sort of a momentum of unenlightenment that is occurring, right? Our mind is presently obscured. Our mind is presently diluted. We don't have insight into the nature of things in the way that an arhat does, in the way that a fully enlightened being does. And that is true. That is validly characterizing our present experience. Um, and so for us, that has always been true for us. Our mind has always been ordinary up until this present moment. So we've always been having ordinary experiences. We've always been incarnating in ordinary environments. That has always characterized our mind and therefore the body that that mind associates with, and therefore the environment in which that body and that mind are located. That's changeable, right? We can achieve enlightenment. We can end the continuity of that ordinariness, and we can begin the continuity of enlightened experience. And then that new continuity of enlightened experience doesn't have past karma and delusion as its origin, is not generated from past karma and delusion. But this lifetime, this birth, this incarnation was in fact generated or impelled by past karma and past delusion. If we put an end to that, then it doesn't impel future things. It will stop impelling, it will stop generating, it will stop being the cause or the origin of future experience. So again, that what that does mean, though, is that this body, this mind, and this environment are all contaminated things. And so, this body, this mind, and this environment are not satisfactory. They are not, and we talked about that last time in terms of the second type of suffering, of the three types of suffering: the suffering of pain, the suffering of change, and all pervasive suffering. So, this body is in the nature of the suffering of change. This mind is in the nature of the suffering of change, and the suffering of sometimes the suffering of suffering. When there's physical pain in the body, or there's a mental pain, then the mind is experiencing that. Um, and then the none of the pleasant experiences that the mind or the body are able to have are truly lasting, real, permanent happiness. They shift into unpleasantness, they shift into discomfort or agitation. um, because they are part of an ordinary environment: food and drink and amusement parks, and they're all part of an ordinary environment. They can't generate, they lack the power to generate real, permanent, lasting bliss, contentment by engaging with them, simply because they are the product of an environment of ordinary minds, and therefore they, by their own nature, they lack that capacity. If we were enlightened, we would exist in an enlightened realm, and we would be interacting with, an environment that was the product of enlightened mind, and that environment does support real, genuine, perfect contentment, bliss, and so on, because it's not a contaminated thing. And because the mind and the body experiencing it are also no longer contaminated things. Um, so the takeaway is that as long as we remain unenlightened, as long as we remain ordinary, then we will possess a body and mind, and we will be engaging with things outside of ourselves, all of which are in kind of in the nature of suffering, none of which are able to give rise to genuine, contentment, satisfaction, bliss, etc. Any thoughts or questions so far?
So if we here now on this earth with myself and you, and we were an enlightened human being, we would not be perceiving any of these sufferings. Is that correct?
Yeah, so an enlightened being would not have a body and mind that was contaminated uh, by past karma and delusion, or would not have past karma and delusion as its origin. So it would be having a very, very different experience of objects. It wouldn't be relating to the objects, because really, um, I mean, I would say that, still. I would say that the bliss and it would be experiencing um, bliss and so on. And that would be coming from the continuity of that mind itself. Like that mind is in the nature of, bliss and contentment and so on. So it really wouldn't need, I mean, yes, it would still, the physical form, in order to maintain the physical forms, food would have to be, taken and so on. Um, and it wouldn't be relating to that food in the way that we do. It wouldn't be relating to it through aversion and attachment, and it would see it, in a very different way. Um, but I mean, whether, I don't think that I'm not sure that an enlightened being who's existing on the earth would have an increase, like in their bliss when they eat chocolate cake versus when they're not eating chocolate cake. I don't know that it would increase in that way. Like for us, the dopamine and all of that, like kind of makes our day better. I don't know that that would happen. So the contaminated things, still would lack the capacity to give rise to those experiences. Um, because that's their nature. They can't give rise to that. But the enlightened being isn't needing that. Their body and their mind are sufficient to sustain that experience.
So, like, I'm sort of thinking, my mind's sort of going back to Lama Zopa. He, we consider him to be an enlightened human being, right? So he would have all those qualities where he would just be like that, right? Yeah.
So then the third seal, this is a teaching that we're probably really going to mainly come back to in the fifth class, rather than because to go through it, it takes 45 minutes to an hour to kind of just spend time making sense of it. Um, but all phenomena are selfless, is this idea, this seal. So um, what this is getting at is really back to the understanding that we were talking about before, about how we cognize, how the mind works, how we develop an understanding of things. As I said, um, when we perceive, we also very, very quickly conceive, and then we join perception and conception, and we feel like what it is that we are interacting with is set up from its own side. We feel like, we go into a room and there's a vase of flowers in that room, and we feel like, well, you know, when we were in the hallway and then we opened the door and we saw it, we think, well, when I was in the hallway, that vase of flowers was there in the room because it's a vase of flowers, that was, I didn't put it there. I didn't see anybody put it there when I opened the door. It was on the table. So when I was in the hallway, that's where it was, and that's what it was. But from the Buddhist perspective, our understanding, our cognition of that phenomenon came into being when we opened the door, when we engaged in, being in relation to it. So in a very real sense, it didn't exist when we were in the hallway because we were not perceiving it, we were not cognizing it. Um, so we give through our perception, through our, the act of being in relation to things. For an ordinary being, there is a view, there is a perspective that we share, that basically all sentient beings share, that things really don't depend on our perception of them, that they have their own status, they have their own they're set up from their own side. And the Buddha disagrees with that. The Buddha says that everything that we know about the object, um, it isn't to say that there's nothing there. It isn't to say that everything is, just a complete fabrication. But what we, everything that we know about the object is filtered in many, many ways. It's filtered through our biology, it's filtered through our culture, it's filtered through our past experience. So, and many other ways in which that phenomenon, our understanding of it, our experience of it, doesn't actually exist in the object itself. It is something, it's a very active aspect that is occurring when we become in relation to that object. And we're really not good at recognizing that, this very, very active quality of our mind. We think that we are passively noticing what is really there, and that everything that seems to be related to that object and phenomenon is, you know, there irrespective of the observer, irrespective of, and again, that goes back to, the chocolate cake and so on. One person looks at it, they think, oh, I can't wait. Their mind is just going crazy thinking, oh, I'm so excited to have this chocolate cake at the end of the, and this other person is like, get me out of here. I got other things to do. And they both feel like the way that they're understanding the object has nothing to do with their mind. They both feel like they've just noticed what is present in their environment. So that's and it goes to subtler and deeper levels than just the attributes. It goes to, like, why is it that we distinguish one thing from another? Why do we give a name to something, and then we have a different thing and we give that a different name, and um, so, but the idea that things have a nature that is independent of the act of cognizing the object, that is the idea of a self, or to say, like, that flower in that room, that just we have this intrinsic sense that it did exist before our perception. um, or when we come back and we see the chair, our chair in our apartment, we think, well, when I get home, that chair, that's there, but we're holding in our mind a conception of it, and then it's confirmed, but what's being confirmed is what we're holding in our own mind. But we're just not attributing that to the mind. We are kind of offloading what's happening in the mind, and we're thinking that what the mind is doing is just passively noticing what is in our environment and not actively creating what's in our environment. So this idea of the passivity that from the Buddhist perspective, that idea that the mind is passively noticing is not true. That would be the idea that things have selves or things have natures, things are independent. Um, what things actually are is selfless. They do depend on our perception of them. They do depend on this very, very active process. And that will become maybe a bit more clear, like I said, in the fifth class when we kind of circle back to that and spend. But if a person says that, that, for example, Buddhism says that we have a mind, right? But our mind is impermanent. Our mind is changing moment by moment by moment. So that is different from the idea that we have a soul that is unchanging, a soul that is fixed, that is permanent, that never changes, that is one thing and only one thing. Um, because the Buddhist perspective would be that, well, in past lives, we have engaged in really terrible, we've been really terrible criminals. We've engaged in really horrible things. And we've also done many wonderful things. We've also really been beneficial to sentient beings. We've given our own lives to protect sentient beings. We've done both of those things, over past lives in different, again and again, we're doing all kinds of different things. And we've had experiences not just in the human realm, but also very, very different kinds of physical forms. Um, so if someone says that, well, we just have one kind of unchanging, permanent soul, that's not a Buddhist teaching. Like that is a teaching from a different perspective, from a non-Buddhist philosophical system. So then the fourth seal is nirvana is peace. So nirvana here can be thought of as we talked about before, lower nirvana and higher nirvana, individual enlightenment, full enlightenment, kind of, again, the stated goal of practice of the Theravadan tradition and the Mahayana tradition. So this would again, and this refers to, as we talked about, the idea of true cessation, right? We talked about these are the two paths of practice, and there are only two kinds of true cessation, either lower nirvana or higher nirvana, individual enlightenment, full enlightenment. So again, if a person says that, that we should just try to go somewhere where our permanent soul can experience like, a really pleasant, kind of realm. But we're still like, we still have our name and we would still say, oh, I'm so and so's sister. And kind of like the Christian idea of heaven, right? Where your sense of personal identity is maintained, but you're just having kind of a party, and like that's sort of the goal. But Buddhism would say that's not peace, like that's not the goal, that's not the ultimate. There might be experiences that are similar to that sentient beings are having, but that's not the ultimate goal. That's not real peace. That's just a temporary experience that maybe is mistaken for peace. So, uh, so yeah. Okay, so those are the four seals, the four ways, and so in order to be a Buddhist, you'd have to, and you don't have to be a Buddhist. Nobody has to be a Buddhist, but if a person was a Buddhist, they would agree with these four seals, and a Buddhist teaching would have to not violate those four seals in order to be validly a Buddhist teaching. So the other way of talking about what it means to be a Buddhist is a person who abides by the five lay precepts. If a person is not a monk or a nun, then they are abiding by the five lay precepts. Uh, and this is referring to the ethical teachings of the Buddha. So, and this is just a quotation from the sutra. Um, so Yes, this is just kind of talking about the Buddha's approach to, ethics. Um, that it, it is from a karmic standpoint, which we'll go into, um, when we engage in actions that are ethical, that are, kind and generous and supportive of others, then we create positive karma. When we engage in unethical actions, those that cause harm to others, we engage in an unethical, or we engage in a negative karma, and positive and negative karmas influence our process of rebirth in positive and negative ways. And that underpins why, where these ethical teachings come from. The ethical teachings, they're not a, a way of like just making society more harmonious or helping people get along. They come from the Buddha's observation that actions that are done from, that are genuinely motivated by positive states of mind, constructive, beneficial, ethical states of mind, that those actions give rise to beneficial effects. They give rise to um, useful, constructive, beneficial results. And conversely, actions that are done that are motivated by unethical, harmful, negative states of mind, those give rise to painful, suffering experiences. And that's why the Buddha provided this ethical framework, was to help us to create the conditions for good future rebirths. Okay. So he sort of derived these from his observation of how the mind, interacts with reality, how the mind moves from life to life, and what the experiences of minds are, and what is the origin of those experiences. He derived these ethical principles from those observations. So the first of the five precepts is to not kill. Do not kill. So killing the precept itself does refer to all sentient beings. It does not exclude any sentient being. Every sentient being is covered by the vow. But there is a difference between killing a human being versus killing a non-human animal. From the Buddhist perspective, animals are separate from humans because of how different their subjective experiences are. Um, so to kill a human actually fully destroys the vow. So when we say the five lay precepts, oftentimes um, a person will formally take these five precepts, these five training precepts, in the ceremony of what's called going for refuge. This is when a person formally becomes a Buddhist, and at that point forward, they are agreeing to be bound by the five lay vows. Um, Prior to that, or if a person doesn't become a Buddhist and they meditate and they just maybe practice certain aspects which is wonderful, just take what is beneficial is wonderful. But if a person chooses to go for refuge, to become Buddhist, then these five precepts become the foundation of their ethical life. So they've then actually taken this vow with a preceptor, with a teacher, in a ceremony. And from that point forward, they're said to be holding or practicing that vow. So if you then intentionally take the life of a human being, you destroy the vow and you're no longer holding it. You're no longer practicing it. You have to, again, take that vow with a teacher. You have to, be like, yeah, I killed somebody, I'm not, I have to take the vow again. If you kill a mosquito, a cockroach, it does damage the vow because again, there are no sentient beings that are that are not included in the vow, but it doesn't destroy the vow. That you can do what's called purification practice, which we'll touch on. You can kind of restore the damage that was done to that vow. But you're meant to do your very best to try to avoid taking the life of any sentient being, on purpose. Of course, when we drive, when you walk on the grass, there are sentient beings that are killed. Um, but it refers to intentionally, looking at the sentient being, wanting to take its life and then taking its life. Um, something that we're really exhorted to avoid. And then again, this is just kind of a sutra teaching on that vow. Any questions on the first vow? Do not kill.
Uh, yeah. So say sort of you do break that first vow, and you do things to, and you're sorry about it and all that sort of stuff. It's still, you still have created that bad karma that will carry on, but haven't you?
Well, so the action, of course, you did the action, right? So the harm that was caused to the sentient being, that's over with. There's nothing you can do about the harm that was caused. The negative karma that was created in that moment, technically, it is possible to completely purify that negative karma, which means that you can prevent it from bringing a suffering result. So there's two different ways. Like, if you scream at someone or you punch someone, like they've been harmed, right? And there's really nothing, which is just as a different example, right? If you insult someone or you hit someone, that other person, you harmed them just then. And there's nothing you can necessarily do. Like, you could apologize, but you can't really control. They may forgive you, they may not. They may hold a grudge, they may never speak to you again. Really nothing you can do about that. Um, but the negative karma that you've created through that action is in your own mind. And the reason that that's a problem is because it will bring a suffering result in the future. And the more suffering results that we have to experience, the more and more difficult it will be to achieve enlightenment, right? Because in order to achieve enlightenment, we probably will need a succession of human lifetimes where there's relatively good conditions, where we're not starving, where we've got access to food, where the teachings exist, in our environment. We can receive those teachings, we can practice those teachings. For the most part, we're not going to achieve enlightenment in a single lifetime. So we're going to die out of this life, and then hopefully we get another human lifetime where there's good conditions, right? And then even with two lifetimes, probably not going to achieve enlightenment, right? We're going to die out of that lifetime. And so we want to set ourselves up for a succession of human lifetimes where we've got conducive conditions, um, which means doing something about all of the negative karma that we've created. Um, because it does function to bring a suffering result in the future. That is how that unfolds. That is how that energy kind of manifests. And we'll talk, we'll go into a bit about purification practice, but that's what it's called in English, um, which again isn't my favorite because it has like a moralistic quality in my mind. I don't like that, but what it means is dealing with that that process, that psychological process that's occurring just within our own mind. Um, in a way, it kind of seems unfair. Like, we kind of we'll think, oh, well, that person killed that person, and like, oh, they created negative karma. And so, oh, they're going to get quote unquote punished by their negative karma, right? And we kind of think that's sort of fair, that's sort of just. But at the same time, the sentient being that's going to experience that suffering is really a very different kind of sentient being, right? Right? Like, the suffering that we are experiencing in this lifetime is the result of an unskillful negative action that could have been created really, really far in the past, right? And we're still having to deal with that in this lifetime. So really, it's not, I mean, this system wasn't designed. It wasn't, it's not like, there's no creator and from the Buddhist perspective, right? So this is really just sort of energy moving through a system. And it wasn't meant to be in a particular way. It wasn't intended, it's very difficult to really learn something, when the cause and the result are separated in time by, could be billions of years, right, between when the cause and when the result, are created and then experienced. So we really should think about it in terms of wanting to purify and wanting others, not wanting, because really the poor, unsuspecting, sentient being that has to experience that suffering result has no idea why they're suffering, has no idea why that painful condition is arising, um, because of some unskillful action in the past. But it is certainly the case that it is possible to completely interrupt that process. Even if it's really intense negative karma, it can be fully interrupted. In theory, it's not easy or simple, but it is doable. It can be. It is. The Buddha taught that it is doable. Um, and then again, this is just another teaching from the Buddha where he's talking about um, abstaining from taking life and the kind of the benefits of that. Okay, the second precept is to not steal. So this is, again, so a person has gone for refuge. They are now bound by the precept of do not steal. And from that point forward, it takes on perhaps a new meaning than it did before. Before, when we thought of stealing, we kind of thought of like breaking into someone's home, going through someone's drawers or their purse, or and like, absconding with something and that kind of, and that is not the definition that we are bound by from this point forward. The definition that we're bound by is to not take anything that's been freely given to us, and freely given by someone who has the authority to give it to us. So, if there's a $10 bill on the street, that's not ours, right? It hasn't been freely given to us by the person who owns it. So we should leave it where it is. We can maybe put a rock over it so it doesn't blow away, or, but we leave it where it is. It's not ours. We don't take it. Um, you know, and and some like monks and nuns, will hold this in a really, really strict way, where, like, for example, if you invite them over, like if they're staying with you, for example, it's good to say, feel free to drink the water, to use the, shower, because until you freely offered it, they're stealing, right? They really can't take a drink of water unless you've offered it to them, unless they, and, I mean, from a practical standpoint, they may or there's different levels, but it's really good, to say if you intend to to give them whatever they need, then you just say, everything that's here is yours, take what you need. Um, and then you've offered it, and then they're not stealing. But you know the way that this precept is formulated, a person is stealing unless they've been given something. Um, and then again, this is actually not a direct teaching of the Buddha, but this is a Bhikkhu Bodhi wrote this. He's a more modern commentator. Um, so he says that this is a mental, state of mind where you have this um, thievish intent, this desire to, that this, you didn't buy whatever it is, it's not yours, but you want to appropriate it for your own use. You want to be the one who gets to use that, to spend the money, to use it. So you think of it as your own. And as soon as you take physical control of whatever it is, and then you regard it as one's own, and you think, oh, this $10 bill is now mine to spend, then you have stolen it. If there's like, a gold bar on the street and you're like, oh, I should really take this to the police station, right? Because it's worth thousands and thousands of dollars and I'm not going to just leave it here. Then you haven't stolen it, right? Your goal is to take it to the police station. They're going to figure it out. But so you haven't appropriated it for your own use. You haven't said, this is mine to do with as I want. Your goal is to give it to the authorities and let them figure it out. um, then that's not stealing. But at the moment that you think, I now can do with this what I want for my own benefit, then you've stolen it. Okay, the third precept, do not commit sexual misconduct. There are two types of sexual misconduct. There's adultery, and then there's non-consensual sexual behaviors. So, adultery is the violation of any reasonable expectation of monogamy. So this means that a person is in an intimate relationship, but it doesn't mean a marriage. We usually use adultery to mean like a legal marriage, and that's not relevant here. What's relevant is that there are two people, and they have, between themselves, they've agreed that there's monogamy in that relationship, that they are not going to go elsewhere in that, they've made that jointly, that decision jointly. And then you violate that reasonable expectation that exists. So you do have to talk about it. You've got to agree to it. It has to be understood. And then you violate that. And there are degrees with which that can be violated, in terms of what's inappropriate. To, fully break it, from the root means that, a fully consecrated act outside of the bounds of monogamy. But of course, things like, hand holding or kissing, those are things that would, of course, damage it, right? That would cause pain, that would cause suffering to the other person. And so there's a spectrum, right? Um, and then anything that's non-consensual, of course, is also covered. So, any kind of forcible behavior that is unwished for, unwanted, would also be covered in terms of sexual misconduct. Um, so there's two ways in which it can be, you can violate this vow, either when you violate a reasonable expectation of monogamy, or you kind of forcibly or in an unwanted way engage in some act toward another person. And then the fifth precept is to not take intoxicants. And this one, in the West, it, um, it the way that it's formulated in the kind of really strict way is that it really does mean do not take, just avoid, which means completely, at all times, just completely. Now, the vow, I mean, the meaning, the intent of the vow is to avoid giving rise to what's here called heedlessness. So the idea is, the Buddha doesn't have a problem with people then, having fun at a party and whatnot. And he's not like against, people. But when a person is in that kind of altered state of mind, they're not really in touch with what is happening in their environment. They begin to lack the ability to respond appropriately to other people that they're around, to circumstances. They may become belligerent. They may forget, they may be unkind. Um, they may not respond. If something happens, their response is going to be impacted by the altered state of mind that they are in. And that's why the Buddha is concerned about it. The concern is that it makes it more likely that we're not going to engage in skillful actions when we're around other people. You know, um, we might act more impulsively. We're going to not have the same kind of introspection, the same kind of, calm, rational mind. And that's the real problem with intoxicants. Now, is a single beer going to give rise to that kind of inability? Probably not. So with this one, I would say it is important to, if a person's going to take it, then it's important, I would say, to get a sense of the preceptor's view on how they're offering it. Do they intend for people to completely abstain? I know, often His Holiness the Dalai Lama, when he does refuge, he might do refuge ceremonies for thousands of people in a stadium. And oftentimes, before he gives that, he'll kind of say, well, if there's like a champagne toast, maybe don't worry about it so much. Like it's okay. It's not that big of a deal. Um, you don't have to be so uptight. But of course, if a person struggles, with stopping, then that's also relevant. For that person, really, they may need to be aware of their own, you know, it- can you really just engage in a champagne toast and it not become a bender? That's relevant for relevant information. Um, because heedlessness is really the key to that. So it is, I would say it's important to get a sense of what your preceptor intends, and then at that point, to decide for yourself. Like, we're all adults, and I mean, if you're a monk or a nun, really there isn't a choice. Like, then it really is more serious. But for a lay person, I would say most lay Buddhists probably have a beer every now and then. Not all of them, but it's you have to kind of, judge for yourself. And excuse me. So then, as it says here, if there's a medicinal purpose, even though it may give rise to heedlessness, we know that, painkillers and so on can affect our mind. We might be in an altered state. And even things like marijuana have valid medicinal purposes. There are seizure disorders. There's all kinds of things where people are valid. And there may be people who are pushing that a little bit, because it's more recreational. But there are valid medical conditions, no question. So the key here is, if a person genuinely has a medical condition and their goal is to try to return themselves to a normal level of functioning with as few side effects as possible. And then in consultation with their doctor, they settle upon some substance, some drug, in order to accomplish that goal, then it is not an intoxicant, even though it may give rise to heedlessness. So they may need to be mindful about when they take it, what circumstances they take it, and so on. But it really, if it's recreational, then it's an intoxicant. If it's medicinal, even though it may give rise to heedlessness, it's not an intoxicant. Um, okay. So that's the end of the material that I had for today.
Did I
Mhm.
miss the fourth one? I've got do not kill, do not steal, do not commit sexual misconduct.
Oh,
What
did
was
I
the
skip? I may
I was
have
going
just
to just
skipped. Sorry.
yeah, four.
Yeah, I skipped over it, I guess. Do
Yeah.
not lie. I'm sorry. I don't know if I.
Sorry, no, that's okay.
Um, yes. So do not lie is the fourth precept. So
Yep.
when we lie, as it says here, we intentionally communicate something that we know to be untrue to another sentient being who is able to understand us and may be deceived by what we're saying. So, um, with this one, it's also, kind of, these are not, as I said, these are not necessarily black and white. Um, in all cases, because we may have to choose between, the lesser of two evils, right? If we're protecting someone from someone, and that person that we're protecting them from comes to us and they say, well, do you know where so and so is? We may have to lie. We may have to say, well, no, I don't, or they're somewhere else, because we know that that person might come to harm if the person that wants to harm them finds where they're located. So we have to be reasonable about all of these and be like, well, we can't just be like, well, the Buddha said I can't lie, so I got to tell this person where to find the person that they would like to harm. Um, but the the baseline understanding of all of these, really, as I mentioned, is that they're derived from negative mental states. The Buddha's observation that negative, so they're proxies, really. All of these are overt actions, but really they're proxies or stand-ins for the underlying negative mental state, right? So when we kill, when we steal, we're doing it out of a sense of just our own, you know, you know, out of anger, out of attachment, um, out of just only thinking about oneself, one's own, not caring about the impact on other people, not caring about how we're how we're influencing, just saying, oh, I would feel more comfortable if this cockroach wasn't in my kitchen. I don't like them, I'm going to kill it. That's just, rather than, oh, this is a sentient being, I'd like to take it outside and I'm going to say prayers and, wish it well. And, we say, I hate it, get it away from me, I'm going to kill it. So these are also with lying, generally when we lie, it's because we want to manipulate other people's understanding in some way. We want to cause someone to be deceived because that works out well for us in some way. They're going to think better of us if or we're going to get what we want. We want to manipulate something so that we're more comfortable, we have more money, other people have a better opinion. So it's that's generally speaking what motivates all of these actions. It's a state of mind where we are not interested in being of benefit to others. We're only interested in getting something for oneself, even at the expense of others. And typically lying, falls into that kind of motivation. It falls into, if this person knew what was true, then something bad would happen to me. If this person understood what was, really going on, then they wouldn't do what I want. They wouldn't say what I wouldn't want. They wouldn't think what I want. They wouldn't give me what I want. So I have to manipulate them. I have to deceive them in order to achieve that objective. And that's really what the Buddha's, that's really harmful. That way of thinking, that way of being in relation to others is really harmful in terms of the negative karma. Um, but if our goal is to protect life, if our goal, is to do something really positive, and we feel like the only way to do that is to kind of be deceptive, then, the Buddha's not saying, cause that, allow that person to come to harm, because at all costs you can't be deceptive. We do have to balance, because we really don't have a negative motivation. We're not in it for ourselves. We're not trying to, we're not trying to manipulate. We're just trying to protect life. That's the goal. Or we're just trying to protect, property, or, someone's well-being, or whatever it might be. If we're free, if we're genuinely free from that negative mental state, then it really isn't a negative action. It's just that overwhelmingly, these are overt actions that exist because of an underlying negative mental state. Very rarely do you kill, do you steal, do you lie, do you commit sexual misconduct, do you take intoxicants with a really good reason, with a really altruistic, kind, motivation, reason that's underlying it. That just generally doesn't happen. So as I say, they're stand-ins or proxies for the psychological process that's there in the mind. And it's that psychological process that the Buddha is really worried about. Do you have any questions about the fourth, about do not lie, or do not take intoxicants, or? All right, as I mentioned, yeah, that's all I've got for today. So yeah, we'll circle back. We're going to start using a text if you want. It's you may be familiar. It's Lama Tsongkhapa's The Foundation of All Good Qualities, that lamrim prayer for the next three classes. We're going to be kind of using that as our guide for the remainder of the classes. That lamrim, which you can find on the internet easily, The Foundation of All Good Qualities. But it'll be screen shared and whatnot. All right, well, have a good week, and I hope to see you back on Tuesday.